Hey, welcome to chapter 14. We're going to talk about keeping food safe. Now, I'm going to do this chapter just a little bit differently. We are going to talk about an overview of the chapter, but I'm also going to go to some of the checkpoint questions that I see in the back of the chapter just to give this chapter a little bit more application to some things we really would want to know about keeping food safe. Okay, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that 48 million Americans, or 1 out of every 6 people, suffer from food-borne diseases annually. Out of these, about 130 are hospitalized and 3,000 people die. So in this lecture, you're going to learn about some common diseases and how to avoid them and minimize the risk of illness. So we have an infectious agent or pathogen, and that is a living microorganism such as bacteria, virus, mold, fungus, or a parasite. And then we have a non-infectious agent, and that is a non-living substance such as a non-bacterial toxin, a chemical residue from processing, pesticides, or antibiotics, or a physical hazard such as glass or plastic. So there are a lot of microorganisms that can have several genetic varieties. It's important to remember that not all microbes are harmful and that each of these can cause illnesses in different ways. The time elapsed between the consumption of a contaminated food and the emergence of sickness is called the incubation period. One of these performed toxins is called Staphylococcus. This bacteria causes nearly 250,000 foodborne illnesses in the United States every year. So the symptoms of severe nausea, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps come on within 1 to 6 hours of the contaminated food consumption. Let's talk about MRSA, MRSA. Because this strain has received considerable attention from public health officials. It was identified more than 40 years ago. At the time, it was believed to spread only through direct contact with an infected person. But now they know it can be shared through towels and equipment in athletic and school facilities, and an infection can occur via consumption of contaminated foods. And some of you might remember that this is one of those strains that came out with wrestlers. In mats, using not wiping the sweat and all of that off of the mats after competitions and things like that. So it's really, really important and we'll talk about sanitation and making sure that things are clean and areas are clean. A person can also become infected with a microbe by eating improperly canned commercial foods. That happens a lot, and that is called botulism. Mild cases of botulism can cause vomiting and diarrhea. Oftentimes, and if it's severe, it can cause double vision, blurred vision, drooping eyelids, slurred speech, difficulty swallowing, dry mouth, and muscle weakness. In some rare cases, it can even cause death. There's certain types of mold that grow on food, such as cheese and bread. Usually they're not dangerous, but some can produce unsafe toxins, such as aflatoxin, which is produced by a mold found on some agricultural crops, such as peanuts, rice, and wheat. It is occasionally found in milk of animals fed with a contaminated feed. The consumption of this is a great concern because this toxin can cause liver damage and cancer and is often fatal. Although many agricultural practices are used to minimize the risk of aflatoxin contamination in the United States, consumption of this toxin remains a significant public health issue throughout many regions of the world. All right, so this type of enteric toxins, which are intestinal, are harmful toxins produced after entering the GI tract. This symptoms usually happen between 1 and 5 days. It draws water into the intestinal lumen, and It usually causes severe symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramping, etc. One of these is the E. coli virus, which most of us are pretty familiar with. There's been some outbreaks of E. coli here in the United States, especially at some fast food restaurants. But the consumption of this food or water contaminated with this bacteria can cause GI upset. Symptoms include diarrhea, abdominal cramps, nausea, and this can be anywhere from 6 to 48 hours after consumption. Foods and beverages typically contaminated with this form of E. coli include uncooked vegetables, fruits, raw and undercooked meats and seafood, unpasteurized dairy products, and untreated tap water. Its primary cause of a condition often referred to as traveler's diarrhea, a clinical symptom resulting from the microbial contamination of food or water during or shortly after travel. If you ever had a severe diarrhea and abdominal cramping while traveling, you might have experienced this type of foodborne illness. Salmonella, it's one of the most common borne illnesses in the United States. It's typically found in raw poultry, eggs, beef, improperly washed fruit, alfalfa sprouts, and unpasteurized milk. The incubation period for this organism is 1 to 3 days, and symptoms typically include severe GI upset and headaches. In 2010, over 1,900 salmonella-related illnesses were reported in 11 states throughout the United States, and this was a result of contaminated eggs. A parasite is an organism that relies on another organism to survive. The consumption of parasite-infested foods can cause foodborne illnesses. An example might be a protozoan, a single-celled organism. They live in the intestinal tracts of animals and humans. As part of its reproductive cycle, it forms a cyst sacs that are excreted in the feces. The cyst-containing feces come in contact with plants or animals used for food, and the result can contaminate food. Thus, if you consume foods that's contaminated with this, you might develop a foodborne illness. There's also parasitic worms, and the symptoms, if you have ingested one of these, may begin within 1 to 2 weeks. You can this particular parasitic worm, called Giardia intestinalis, can be found in untreated swimming pools and hot tubs, in rivers, ponds, and streams that have been contaminated with the feces of an infected animal or person. Chlorine, the stuff will kill it, and it's typically added to the water in public swimming pools and bathing areas, boiling, chemically treating, or filtering water from ponds, streams, and lakes. There's something called prions. They're not living organisms. In fact, they're not organisms at all, but they pose food safety concerns. A prion is an altered protein created when the secondary structure of a normal protein is disrupted. Protein can cause other normal proteins to unravel, setting off a cascade of similar reactions that convert hundreds of normal proteins into abnormal ones. When large numbers of these build up on a cell, the cell can rupture and release its prions into the surrounding area, which can in turn destroy their cells. Eventually, this process kills the surrounding cells and gives the infected tissue a spongy texture. Prions, unfortunately, they're extremely resistant. Therefore, merely cooking food does not destroy them. If a prion-contaminated food is consumed, the prions can actually get in the bloodstream. This is where the term mad cow disease comes from. Some of you may have heard of that. And that's a loss of motor control, confusion, paralysis, wasting, and eventually death. It occurs, unfortunately, about 1 in every million people each year. And there are a couple of examples of some of those prion diseases that have developed. Because prions are found mainly in the nerves and the brain, the World Health Organization recommends that all government prohibit the feeding of highly inverted tissues, such as brain and spinal cord, from slaughtered cattle to other animals. Infectious substances include physical contaminants such as glass and plastic and other dangerous substances such as toxins, heavy metals, and pesticides. I'm going to just take a side note here. This is one of the reasons why eating or looking for organic products are important, because a lot of these companies have taken extra measures to make sure that none of these things that we're talking about are included as in the foods, especially when it comes to the pesticides. So we have angle-toxins, and this is also can be called shellfish poisoning. It can result from the consumption of particular types of contaminated fish, like clams and oysters. It can be in marine animals that consume large amounts of ocean algae and sometimes produce poisonous marine toxin compounds. Eating marine toxin contaminated food can cause tingling, burning, numbness, drowsiness, and difficulty breathing. People with shellfish poisoning may be experiencing a strange phenomenon called hot-cold inversion, whereby cold is perceived as hot and vice versa. One variety of shellfish poisoning is caused by a phenomenon referred to as red tide. This phenomenon occurs when a particular marine algae grows too quickly. As it multiplies, it produces brightly colored pigments that bloom outward and make the surrounding water appear red or brown. During this rapid period of growth, the algae produce a toxin called brevetoxin, which when consumed by humans causes shellfish poisoning. Approximately 30 cases of shellfish poisoning are reported in the United States every year, with the most cases occurring in the coastal regions of the Atlantic Northeast and Pacific Northwest. It's important to note here, this is why a lot of doctors will discourage eating seafood or shellfish or any type of that during pregnancy. There isn't any food production system that is foolproof. Illness-causing pesticides, herbicides, antibiotics, and hormones sometimes can come in contact with food products. A number of national and international agencies work together to ensure the presence of these contaminants in food is negligible or poses no known risks to the consumer or environment. For example, BST, otherwise known as bovine growth hormone, attracted public attention in recent years. This hormone is produced naturally by cattle and is used in dairy industry to increase milk production. But some people are concerned about its safety. A substantial amount of research suggests that this BST is safe for both cows and consumers. Because the evidence stands in the compound's favor, the FDA continues to allow BST, and there are no laws requiring milk produced by cows treated with BST be labeled as such. But even after a compound such as BST has been approved, the FDA will continue to evaluate its safety. And just a side note, again, if you buy organic milk, you're going to be assured that this BST is not going to be in that milk. And even though the FDA says it's safe now, who knows in the long term, down the road if we're not going to find harmful things that it causes. And that happens quite a bit. So food allergies and sensitivities. Certain non-infectious compounds can cause illness in small segments of the population, but not because they are toxic or poisonous. Instead, these compounds cause illness only for those people who are especially sensitive or allergic to them. So MSG has been a big buzz lately. A lot of people have taken, or a lot of manufacturers have taken MSG out of their products because so many people were getting sick. But it is a flavor enhancer used in commercially processed food. It can cause headaches, facial flushing, and generalized burning sensation in some people. MSG must be listed on the label of any food if it is added. Similarly, sulfite compounds are sometimes added to foods such as wine and dried fruits to enhance color or prevent spoilage. Unfortunately, the consumption of sulfite causes breathing difficulties in people that are sensitive to this, especially those with asthma. So the FDA requires food manufacturers to label all food that contain at least 10 milliliters of sulfite or more. And the book will list about 6 different chemicals that you can look for to see if that has been added to your foods. So I highly recommend actually going through the book and looking at that and learning how to read labels. So we have other safety concerns, and that can even be in what it's packaged. A lot of times when things are packaged, there's chemicals that can seep into your foods just from the packaging. One of those is called acrylamide. It's a substance used to make polyacrylamide, which is employed in a number of food packaging materials. This substance can form in starchy foods exposed to high temperatures, and it can be very harmful to humans. There's melamine, and it's a nitrogen-containing chemical, which is typically used to make lightweight plastic objects such as dishes. It caused, in 2007, they found that a lot of dogs and cats became ill and even died. Then we have gluten, which is a wheat protein commonly used to produce a number of foods, including animal foods. Because melamine is rich in nitrogen, some Chinese gluten manufacturers added melamine to their products to make them appear higher in protein than they actually were. So after the story released, public attention quickly shifted to the possibility that melamine could enter the human food supply as well. So in response, the FDA and the USDA issued a press release stating that consumption of meat and milk from animals fed melamine tainted feed posed very low risk to humans. But however, there was about 60,000 infants and children throughout China that became sick due to this contamination. So now they reverse that, and FDA now advises consumers will want to avoid using it, especially in infant formula, milk products, and products with milk-derived ingredients made in China. Again, if you are going to buy more organic products, you can avoid a lot of these safety hazards that we're looking at here, because even there are regulations that even down to the packaging that they have to comply to in order to keep their food chemical free. So we've all heard of BPA. This has been a big buzz lately, especially since water bottles have come out. This is something that is a chemical found in plastic and beverages. It was in baby bottles. It's shown to increase the long-term risk of cancer and reproductive abnormalities in laboratory animals. Scientists and public health officials are currently studying whether consumption of foods and beverages from these types of containers poses risk to humans as well. In 2010, it was concerned that the potential effects of BPA in the brain, behavior, and development of fetuses, infants, and young children. So the FDA has really encouraged individuals to decrease their own exposure to BPA, choose glass or metal containers, refrain from heating plastics in the microwave, and wash your plastic containers by hand instead of in the dishwasher. So how do food manufacturers prevent contamination? Well, countless pathogens and inert compounds can cause foodborne illness. So it's important for you to understand how disease-causing agents of all types are transmitted from one food surface or utensil to another, or from one person to another person, and this has caused cross-contamination. To prevent foodborne illness, it's critical those who handle food do so safely and sanitarily. That's why you'll see a lot of restaurant workers using gloves. It's important that food handlers, from the way it's harvested to processed to prepare the food. Avoid coughing or sneezing on the foods. In addition, many pathogens pass through the GI tract that are excreted in the feces. Handlers must ensure that fecal matter does not come in contact with food. So it's very important, again, for people to really wash their hands correctly after using the bathroom if you work around the food or in the food service industry. Food production, preservation, and packaging. Beyond safe food handling practices, the food processing industry adheres to additional regulations that keep your food safe. For instance, the USDA requires that meat and poultry be inspected before they are sold, and that guidelines for safe handling appear on the packages. Food manufacturers also use drying, salting, smoking, fermentation, heating, freezing, and irradiation to help keep food safe. And again, some of these ways of keeping your food safe are healthy and a natural way to keep them safe. And then sometimes they could be preserved with chemicals. And so you want to try to stay away from the ones that are preserved with chemicals. So meat has long been preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, which obviously can be a very natural way to keep them from fermenting. So in addition, the process of fermentation promotes the growth of non-pathogenic organisms, which in turn minimize the growth of pathogenic organisms and preserves the food. A lot of your organic foods will be done with the drying, salting, and smoking process. It takes a little bit, from what I understand, a little bit more time, sometimes more money to do it that way. And some of those products don't last as long as if they were preserved with chemicals. But obviously, the long-term effects that it can do, or even short-term effects that can happen in your body, is if it's not preserved in a natural way, it's obviously, I feel like, worth the cost of buying the more expensive foods. In the long run, you're better off. All right, because most microorganisms prefer living in an environment that's 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature is often very important. If it is out of range, your food can be in the danger zone. And so there's all types of regulations about how food has to be cooked or how food has to be stored or refrigerated in order to avoid toxin-free, in order to avoid toxins that will keep it free from you getting sick. There's also pasteurization, the process whereby food is partially sterilized through brief exposure to high temperature. It's perhaps the most common form of heat treatment used in food preservation. Foods that are typically pasteurized are milk, juice, spices, ice cream, and cheese. However, this is just a side note, when these things are pasteurized and heated to such high temperatures, they also lose a lot of their nutrients. And so if you can, again, do some research and find some juices and those types of things that have not been pasteurized but have been in a controlled environment to make sure that they're not going to get the bacteria that could happen if they did not go through the pasteurization process, is healthier for you. So a lot of times you'll see something that says non-pasteurized juice in a health food store. It's going to have a lot more nutrients in that juice because it wasn't killed through the pasteurizing process. And there's different ways to make sure that these non-pasteurized juices aren't going to be exposed to bacteria. One of them is called cold press, and that's just a system that they can do to process the juices that won't lose the nutrients. But I encourage you to learn more about that so that you can make wise choices and make sure that you eat foods that are safe, but yet you're eating foods that are still very high in nutrients. Here are some guidelines for cooking, serving, and reheating foods. So you might want to look through there. The great thing is we have the internet now, and most of the times you can find things on the internet. There's been times where I've put something in the refrigerator and I kind of want to know would this be good 2 days later or 3 days later or whatever? And so I'll kind of quickly look that up on the internet, and most of the time it tells me to throw it out. When in doubt, throw it out. That's what I always hear if you don't want to get sick. All right, in the 1950s, that NASA first used irradiation to preserve food for space travel. So today, irradiation is approved for meat, poultry, shellfish, eggs, fresh fruits, vegetables, and spices. But during irradiation, foods are exposed to radiant energy that damages or destroys bacteria. Irradiation makes food safer to eat and can dramatically increase shelf life. However, again, with this process, it is being exposed to radiation, so it might be something that you want to do some more research on to make sure that that's not going to do harmful things in the future. What can you do to reduce foodborne illnesses? To help consumers avoid the infectious agents that cause foodborne illnesses, the USDA and the Partnership for Food Safety Education developed a set of food safety guidelines called Fight Back. The major components that comprise Fight Back are clean, separate, cook, and chill. So separate is that prevents cross-contamination, so make sure you separate your meats from your fruits. That's very practical. When you cook, make sure you're cooking it thoroughly. Make sure you use a thermometer. Remember, it's especially important for pregnant women, infants, and older adults, and people with impaired immunity to make sure that we cook things properly. And chill. Cold temperatures can slow the growth of microorganisms, so you should always strive to keep perishable foods chilled, refrigerated. Similarly, thaw a frozen food in the refrigerator, submerge in an airtight bag in cold water, or in the microwave instead of at room temperature. And then when you eat out, make sure your food is safe, especially when you're at a picnic or a potluck or buffet. Here's some questions that you might want to ask. How likely is it that the people handling preparing the food use sanitary practices? Is there evidence that raw ingredients were kept separate from cooked ones? Is it likely that food was cooked properly and kept at a thermic danger zone? And is there evidence that cold ingredients were kept cold? Okay, when you're traveling, it's advisable to drink bottled water and avoid using ice. Although fresh produce that is contaminated with bacteria may not cause illnesses for local residents, it can cause serious illness for visitors. So when you're traveling to a foreign country, make sure you wash fresh fruit and vegetables or peel them. Although sometimes the peeling contains a lot of nutrients as well. And so again, do your research and learn how to properly clean your vegetables and fruits so that you don't lose the nutrients by peeling all that off. The CDC recommends that when traveling in Europe or another area that has reported cases of BSE, that's what we talked about, in cows, that you might avoid eating beef. Emergence of global terrorism has raised new concerns about food safety, both at home and abroad. Indeed, a terrorist or militant faction could do serious widespread harm by contaminating America's food supply. As a result, we have a threat now called food biosecurity, measures aimed at preventing the food supply from falling victim to planned contamination. That's why it's important even to understand where the origin of your food comes from. And of course, again, doing as much organic, fresh fruit and vegetables from the farm to your plate would be a great way to ensure that the foods are coming from within the United States or locally, to be specific. And that's all about Chapter 14. If you have any questions or concerns, make sure you let me know.